It was a quiet autumn evening when Officer Clayton Thompson received an unusual phone call. The dispatcher had patched through a woman's frantic voice, trembling with fear as she explained her situation. The woman, whose name was later identified as Rebecca Matthews, told Clayton she had been feeling as though someone was watching her from the shadows, even though she couldn't see anyone. She claimed the feeling had started a few hours earlier and had grown more intense with time. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then she began to hear footsteps behind her, pacing in perfect rhythm with hers. Rebecca was quick to dismiss it at first, attributing it to paranoia, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She told Clayton that every time she turned around there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped when she did, only to start again when she resumed walking. This wasn't the only unsettling thing. She could hear faint whispering in the air, voices that seemed to drift from an unknown source, too faint to make out the words, but just clear enough to feel the dread they carried. It wasn't until she saw a figure standing in her front yard, staring through her window, that her fear reached its peak. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, and just standing there motionless. She didn't recognize it, and every time she tried to get a better look, the figure would vanish into the night, only to reappear moments later in a different position, watching her. Frightened out of her mind, Rebecca decided to call for help. She dialed the non-emergency police number, and after a brief conversation, it was determined that a squad car would be dispatched to her home. When Clayton answered the call, he knew he had to act fast. He reassured Rebecca that help was on the way, and promised her that he would get there as quickly as possible. The night was cold, the air sharp with the onset of winter, and Clayton, although seasoned in handling bizarre situations, couldn't shake the sense of unease that crept up his spine as he drove to the address. Rebecca's distress call seemed to scratch at something deep within Clayton, a sensation he couldn't fully explain. Something in her voice didn't sound like the typical anxiety of someone hearing noises in the night. It felt urgent. It felt real. It felt wrong. His instincts told him there was more to this case than a woman being overly paranoid about a random intruder or a local prankster. As he drove through the empty streets, the rhythmic ticking of his patrol car's engine was the only sound, eerily amplifying the silence that surrounded him. By the time Clayton reached Rebecca's house, his unease had only grown. Something was off. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the house as he parked in front of it. Rebecca's house sat at the edge of town, surrounded by trees, making the darkness that much more oppressive. The windows of the house were pitch black and there was no sign of movement inside. Clayton checked his watch. Nearly 30 minutes had passed since Rebecca's call. She should have been waiting outside, but there was nothing. He stepped out of his car, calling out to her as he approached the front door. The silence was suffocating. When Officer Clayton Thompson stepped up to the front door of Rebecca Matthews's house, a sense of foreboding settled in his chest. He knocked, calling out her name, but there was no answer. He knocked again, this time with more urgency, hoping for some sign that she was there. But the house remained still. The quietness was unnatural, as if the entire property had been swallowed by the night, leaving behind only the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. His hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment he hesitated. A strange impulse told him to turn back, to call for backup and leave the scene entirely. But Clayton wasn't one to ignore his duty, especially in the face of fear. He twisted the knob, and the door creaked open. He was met with a thick, stale air that felt almost oppressive. Clayton's flashlight cut through the dim interior of the house, revealing a tidy living room with no signs of a struggle or disorder. The furniture was in place, the floor clean, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary, except for the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The silence weighed heavily on him as he stepped inside, glancing around with a sense of unease that only grew with each passing second. "Rebecca?" he called out, his voice carrying through the empty house, but it echoed back at him as though the sound had been swallowed whole by the walls. No response. No footsteps. No movement. Nothing. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch on forever in the dim light, the faint outline of closed doors on either side creating an air of abandonment. Clayton walked cautiously, his boots making soft thuds on the hardwood floor. As he passed one door, he noticed a shadow moving across the corner of his vision. He froze. It was brief, a flicker of something, but enough to make his heart skip a beat. He swung his flashlight toward the area, but there was nothing there. Just the same lifeless walls and empty rooms. He approached the stairs and paused, the strange sensation of being watched intensifying. His instincts screamed at him to turn around and leave, but he couldn't do that. Not after what Rebecca had reported. He had to make sure she was safe. Something deep inside told him that this wasn't just an ordinary call. It was something more, something darker. As he ascended the staircase, his flashlight beam trembled slightly in his grip, and his breath quickened. The quietness of the house was oppressive, suffocating almost, and the stillness made it feel as if the house itself were holding its breath. He called out for Rebecca again, this time a little louder, more forceful. But once again, there was no response. By now, Clayton's unease had become palpable. He knew this house. It was a quiet suburban home at the edge of town. But tonight it felt different. The air was thick with a weight he couldn't describe, like the atmosphere itself was holding something just beyond his reach. The longer he stayed, the more unsettling it became. He made his way down the hallway toward the back of the house where he knew the kitchen and a small dining room were. As he moved further, he noticed that the hallway itself seemed to stretch longer than it should. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing thicker with each step. The lights above him flickered, casting odd, distorted shapes on the walls. Something didn't feel right about this place, and Clayton's gut instinct told him that he was no longer just dealing with a missing persons case. He was standing at the edge of something far darker than he could have ever anticipated. After an unnerving search through the upper floors of Rebecca's house, Clayton was left with only one option. He had to check the basement. He hadn't heard any noise from down there, but something about the house made him feel like he had no choice. The front door had been open when he arrived, yet there was no sign of Rebecca or anyone else inside. Could she be hiding down there? Or had something happened to her? The unease was gnawing at him, but he tried to stay focused. He reached the door leading to the basement, a worn wooden thing that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The air around it felt colder, like the house itself was holding its breath. He reached for the knob and it creaked ominously as it turned. Clayton paused for a moment, listening intently. It was deathly quiet. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the shadows, revealing concrete floors and bare walls. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. As Clayton moved further into the space, he began to feel like the basement was alive, like it was waiting for something. The silence was thick and suffocating, and Clayton couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just out of sight. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the area with his light. But there was nothing unusual. No signs of a struggle. No signs of anyone being there. Just shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting and warping as the light from his flashlight flickered. Then, without warning, he heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, tapping lightly on the concrete floor. They were slow, methodical, almost deliberate, and they came from somewhere deep within the basement. Clayton's heart raced, He wasn't alone. He wasn't imagining it. "Rebecca," he called again, his voice a little shaky. The footsteps stopped, and the silence became even more oppressive. Clayton's grip on his flashlight tightened, his instinct screaming at him to leave. But instead, he pushed forward, his boots echoing as he walked deeper into the basement. The footsteps resumed, now closer, too close. Clayton's breath caught in his throat. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he turned toward the sound. The footsteps stopped again. And then, just as Clayton was about to speak again, he heard a voice. A low, almost inaudible whisper. It was his name. "Clayton." His blood ran cold. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but there was no one there, only shadows. The whisper came again. "Clayton." The temperature dropped even further, and Clayton's mind raced. What was happening? What was in this basement with him? The moment Clayton heard the whisper, a wave of dread washed over him. His flashlight flickered again, its beam growing weaker as though it were fighting against something unseen. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, drowning out the soft, incessant whisper of his name. He stood frozen, straining to hear any other sounds, but all he could hear was the steady rhythm of his own breathing. The basement was suffocatingly quiet, but at the same time it felt alive, like something was watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the flashlight's beam sputtered one last time before completely going out. The room plunged into pitch blackness, and Clayton's breath caught in his throat. The darkness was oppressive, like it was thickening around him, closing in, swallowing every trace of light, every shred of his sanity. He tried to turn the flashlight back on, but it refused to work. Panic surged in his chest, and his pulse quickened as he fumbled with the flashlight. He couldn't see anything, nothing but an endless, swallowing black. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he could feel something, no, someone, moving in the dark with him. The air grew colder still, a biting chill that sank into his bones, and he could feel it creeping up his spine, a sensation that felt like invisible fingers crawling across his skin. Clayton's breathing grew shallow. He turned quickly, instinctively reaching for the door, desperate to escape the crushing darkness, but as he moved, he heard something behind him. The unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. He spun around, his heart racing as he felt a presence, an intangible, suffocating presence drawing closer. He couldn't see, but he could feel it, like something was just inches away from him. "Rebecca," he called out, his voice trembling now, his hands shaking as he gripped the doorframe. No answer. Instead, the whisper came again. It was closer this time, almost directly behind him. "Clayton." His breath caught in his throat. This time, the whisper wasn't just a voice. There was something otherworldly about it, something wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the air around him felt electric, as if reality itself was bending in this place. Suddenly, he felt an icy hand grip his arm. His entire body went rigid with shock, and for a moment he couldn't move. His heart pounded in his ears as he tried to wrench free from the cold, unyielding grip. But it held on tight, tighter than anything humanly possible. The cold seeped through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. Clayton opened his mouth to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe. He struggled, trying to pull away, but the hand only tightened. The darkness around him seemed to press in, growing thicker, more suffocating with every passing second. And then, the whispers grew louder. Louder still, voices that surrounded him, muttering in languages that felt ancient, alien. He couldn't understand them, but the fear in their tone was unmistakable. The basement felt alive, the walls pulsating as though the house itself were breathing. With one final, desperate effort, Clayton pulled away from the grip. He lunged toward the basement door, his feet slipping on the cold concrete, and with one powerful shove he forced the door open. Light flooded back in, and Clayton stumbled out of the basement, his heart hammering in his chest, the whispers still echoing in his mind. But as he stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The door to the basement slammed shut behind him. Clayton stood frozen in the hallway, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The weight of the darkness from the basement clung to him, following him as though it were alive. He turned, his heart racing, and glanced toward the door that had just slammed shut with an unnerving finality. The oppressive silence of the house now felt like a heavy weight, crushing his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He looked at the door, again, then back at the empty space around him. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and twist, crawling along the walls, alive with an energy he couldn't explain. Panic gripped him like a vice. There was something here, something he couldn't understand or even describe. But it was real, and it had made itself known in the most terrifying way. Desperate to make sense of what was happening, Clayton reached for his radio, intending to call for backup. His hand trembled as he turned the dial, but instead of the usual crackle of static and communication, he was met with an eerie silence. His radio was dead. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up again, and he glanced nervously toward the basement door, which seemed to loom like a dark mouth swallowing everything in sight. Then came the worst realization of all. He had come here to find Rebecca, but he hadn't seen her since the moment he entered the house. What if she wasn't here at all? What if the house was empty? Empty except for something far worse. His thoughts swirled in a dizzying spiral of confusion and terror. Clayton turned to leave, his instinct to get out overpowering everything else. But as he reached for the front door, he froze. Rebecca's car was still parked outside, but there was no sign of her. No sign of anyone, for that matter. As he stepped back toward the door, the strange sensation of being watched crept over him once again. He looked around, but the house remained eerily still. Then a whisper broke the silence again, this time unmistakably clear. "Clayton." It was coming from behind him. Before he could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the darkness. They were slow, methodical, and they came closer and closer until they filled his ears. Clayton spun around, but when he did, there was no one there. No Rebecca. No shadows. Only an empty hallway. The door to the outside was still wide, open. But when Clayton tried to leave, something strange happened. His legs wouldn't move. It was as though an invisible force was holding him in place, his body refusing to obey him. His vision blurred. The world around him seemed to warp. And suddenly everything went black. The following morning, the police arrived at the scene, expecting to find Clayton, perhaps a missing person case that had gone wrong. But what they found was far more chilling. Clayton's squad car was still parked outside, the driver's side door open as though he had been in a hurry to leave. But Clayton was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry. In fact, there was no sign of Clayton at all. The officers searched the house top to bottom, combing through every room, the basement, the yard, everywhere. The only thing they found was Clayton's badge lying on the ground outside near the doorstep. It was stained with something dark, something that resembled dried blood, but there was no trace of Clayton. No clues, no evidence. Just an empty house and an eerie sense of abandonment. When they examined the basement, the chalky symbol on the wall stood out, a symbol neither of the officers recognized. It was an intricate design, drawn hastily but with an intensity that made it feel alive. The officers couldn't make sense of it, but it seemed to pulse with an energy that made their stomachs turn. The case was quickly filed as unsolved. There were no answers, no leads, and no new developments. It remained an enigma, a dark mystery that would eventually fade from public attention but would never be forgotten. Years passed, and the story of Officer Clayton Thompson's disappearance became just another tale whispered in the halls of the police department. But it wasn't forgotten. Strange reports began to surface, stories told by officers and civilians alike. Sometimes officers on night shifts would hear faint footsteps behind them in alleyways, or see fleeting shadows out of the corners of their eyes. At first, these were dismissed as coincidences, but as the sightings grew more frequent, the fear grew. Then, it happened again. Another officer, this time a young rookie named Sarah Jensen, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. She had been assigned to a night patrol near the same neighborhood where Clayton had vanished. A week later, her body was found, cold and lifeless, her expression frozen in terror, as if she had seen something no one should ever see. She had also vanished from a place that should have been safe. The same quiet streets, the same empty houses. The whispers continued. Some officers claimed to hear Clayton's voice crackling through their radios in the dead of night. Others claimed they had seen the shadowy figure of a tall man standing in the dark corners of crime scenes, an ever-present reminder that some things shouldn't be investigated. The case of Officer Clayton Thompson was never solved, but over time it became clear. The house, the basement, the whispers, whatever had taken him, still lingered, waiting. And as long as the mystery remained, it would never truly be over.